Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive here on Stock Explorers. And for today's deep dive, we're going to be taking a look at Pfizer.
Okay.
We've got a lot of different sources that we're going to be pulling from as we kind of take a look and try to give you guys the most relevant insights for potential investors. And yeah, we're just going to cover their recent activities, their strategic direction, and kind of where they're positioned in the market.
Right.
So we're hoping to give you a good picture of things so that you can make an informed decision.
Sounds good.
If you guys get some value out of this, please subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up, hit that notification bell, and let's get started.
I think one of the things that jumps out right away is this whole divestiture of Haleon that Pfizer completed recently.
Yeah.
They sold the remaining stake for about $3.3 billion.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant chunk of change, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Looking at the details here, it looks like they sold around 662 million ordinary shares. A lot of it went to institutional investors, but it also looks like Haleon itself repurchased about 44 million shares.
Okay, so what do you think is behind this decision for Pfizer to fully separate from Haleon at this stage?
Well, I think if we kind of zoom out a little bit and look at some broader industry trends,
Okay.
we've seen a number of big pharmaceutical companies divesting either consumer health or generics divisions.
Okay.
And I think, this really suggests that they're trying to kind of narrow their focus.
Yeah.
And I think Pfizer's move here is a pretty clear signal that they're going to be doubling down on innovative pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen similar moves from other major players in the industry, all kind of trying to streamline their focus, so to speak.
Exactly.
And in the case of Pfizer, it seems like their focus is increasingly on certain therapeutic areas. Oncology and rare diseases are kind of coming up more and more.
Yeah, and their acquisitions of CN and Global Blood Therapeutics are really a testament to that. I mean, they're putting some serious money behind those strategic priorities.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they're making some strategic moves to bolster their position in those high growth areas.
For sure.
Now, I'm curious about the financial impact of this Haleon sale for Pfizer. It's a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
From what I've gathered, they got about 2.5 billion pounds from this transaction.
Wow, that's a lot of financial firepower. I mean, that must open up quite a few doors for them, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
It really gives them the flexibility to either pursue new strategic investments, maybe even look at other acquisitions that kind of align with this focus on biopharmaceuticals, or it could even just allow them to strengthen their balance sheet.
Okay, so they've got options.
Exactly.
But what does it mean for Pfizer now that they don't have that ownership stake in Haleon?
Right. So starting in 2025,
Okay.
they're no longer going to be including the equity method income they were getting from Haleon.
Okay, can you explain what that is for people who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. Basically, it means that Pfizer was accounting for their share of Haleon's profits as income.
Okay.
And now that they've fully divested, that's no longer going to be part of their financial picture.
I see.
So it's kind of a trade-off. They get this upfront cash, but they're losing out on that consistent revenue stream.
Okay, interesting. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some market activity that we've observed with Pfizer's stock.
Okay.
Specifically on March 22nd, 2025, there was a lot of movement.
Interesting.
Now, unfortunately, the specific stock data that we have access to cuts off a little bit before that date.
Okay.
But we do know that there was a company event that was scheduled for March 22nd.
Got it.
So it's possible that could have something to do with the increased activity that we were seeing.
Makes sense.
But more broadly, can you just remind us what unusually high trading volume typically indicates?
Well, usually a lot of trading volume means that there's a lot of investor interest. This could be because of a big announcement, a major event, or even just a lot of news coverage.
Right.
And what's important to remember is that periods of high volume like this, they can often lead to more price volatility.
That makes sense.
Because the market is trying to figure out what's going on and what it means for the stock.
Yeah, a lot of buying and selling happening as people react to new information.
Exactly.
So it's interesting that this high volume occurred around the time that the Haleon divestiture was being finalized.
Right.
I think that was around March 20th. So it seems plausible that investors might have been reacting to that news and just kind of like trying to figure out what it all means for the future of Pfizer.
Yeah, I think that's a very likely scenario. They're probably trying to understand how this divestiture fits into Pfizer's overall strategy.
Yeah.
What does it mean for their earnings? What does it mean for their growth prospects?
Right. Absolutely.
So, with all this cash coming in from the Haleon sale, I think it's really interesting to look at how the market is reacting.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Pfizer's drug pipeline,
Okay.
because they've got some interesting things in development. And one that has been getting a lot of attention, especially with the growing focus on obesity treatments, is danuglipron.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about what danuglipron is and what makes it so promising?
Yeah, so danuglipron is an oral small molecule,
Oh.
and it's what's called a GLP-1 receptor agonist.
Right.
And they're investigating it for both type 2 diabetes and obesity.
Interesting.
And it basically works by mimicking the effects of a naturally occurring hormone
Right.
that helps to regulate things like insulin secretion, how fast your stomach empties, and also helps to reduce appetite.
So it sounds like it's kind of working in a similar way to some of these other really effective weight loss medications that we've seen recently. But the key difference here is that it's taken orally,
Exactly.
which, for a lot of people, that could be a much more appealing way to take medication.
It's a lot more convenient
Yeah,
than having to inject yourself.
for sure.
And the early results have been really promising. They've shown weight reduction and improved blood sugar control in people with type 2 diabetes.
That's really encouraging.
Yeah, but they did run into some problems in earlier trials with a twice-daily formulation.
Right, I remember hearing about some issues with the tolerability of the drug.
Yeah, so in their phase 2b trial,
What?
where they were testing that twice-daily version, they saw pretty impressive weight reductions. I mean, we're talking 8 to 13% over 32 weeks.
Wow, that's significant.
It is, but the problem was that over 50% of the participants ended up dropping out of the trial because of side effects.
Oh, wow. It's a pretty high dropout rate.
It is.
What kind of side effects were they experiencing?
Mostly gastrointestinal issues.
Okay.
Things like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea.
Yeah, that's rough. So over 50% discontinuation
Yeah.
because of those issues. That really underscores the challenge of developing these weight loss drugs.
Definitely.
You want them to be effective, but you also want people to be able to tolerate them.
Right. It's all about finding that balance.
So what are they doing to try to address those tolerability issues?
So they're now focusing on a once-daily formulation.
Okay.
And the hope is that this will be easier on people's systems.
Makes sense.
They're planning to do some dose optimization studies with this new formulation in the second half of this year, 2024.
Okay.
And then they'll use that data to design their larger trials that they need for regulatory approval.
So still some hurdles to clear, but the potential payoff is pretty huge.
It is. The obesity market is massive, and it's only getting bigger.
Yeah, and even Pfizer's CEO has expressed some optimism about danuglipron's potential.
He has.
He's been cautious, but he's also been emphasizing the convenience of an oral drug compared to those injections.
Right. It's a big selling point.
Absolutely. Now, I know we were also talking about sulopenem, which is another compound in their portfolio.
Yes.
And this one has a little bit of a different story because it was licensed out to Iterum Therapeutics.
Right.
So can you give us a quick rundown on sulopenem?
Sure. So sulopenem is a new type of antibiotic.
Okay.
It's what's called a penem.
Okay.
And it can be given both orally and intravenously.
Okay. Okay.
Pfizer actually licensed it to Iterum back in 2015.
Okay.
And it's been shown to be really effective against a wide range of bacteria, including a lot of the ones that are resistant to other antibiotics.
Okay. And I understand there's been some positive news recently regarding sulopenem.
Yes. So in the last quarter of 2024,
Okay.
the FDA approved Iterum's oral formulation of sulopenem,
Okay.
which is marketed under the name ORLY-NVAH.
Okay.
And it's specifically approved for uncomplicated UTIs in adult women
Right.
who have limited or no other treatment options.
So it's kind of targeting a specific niche
Right.
where there's a real need for new antibiotics.
Exactly. And this is particularly significant because it's the first new oral penem antibiotic to be approved in the U.S. in over 20 years,
Wow.
which is kind of a big deal.
It is, especially with antibiotic resistance becoming such a major concern. Now, even though Pfizer licensed this drug out, they're still getting something out of this approval, right?
Yeah. So as part of the licensing deal,
All right.
Iterum has to pay Pfizer a $20 million milestone payment.
Okay.
Now, they have deferred that payment,
Okay.
but it's still money that Pfizer is going to be getting.
Right. So it's still a financial win for them, even though they're not directly selling the drugs
Yeah.
themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. All right, so now let's dive into the competitive landscape a little bit because, as we know in the pharmaceutical industry, it's rarely smooth sailing,
Right.
and Pfizer is facing some competition in a few different areas.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's start with the anti-infective space.
Okay.
There's a drug called gepotidacin that's being developed by GSK,
I've heard of that one.
and it's being looked at for UTIs and also urogenital gonorrhea.
Okay.
And what's interesting about gepotidacin is that it has a unique mechanism of action.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so it actually targets two different enzymes that are involved in bacterial DNA replication.
Interesting.
Um, and this kind of dual targeting approach is thought to make it harder for bacteria to develop resistance.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so where are they at with the development of gepotidacin?
So they've completed phase 3 clinical trials,
Okay.
and the results were really good.
Okay.
They showed that it was just as effective as nitrofurantoin, which is one of the standard treatments for UTIs.
Okay.
And in one of the trials, it actually worked even better.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, and the FDA has granted priority review to GSK's application.
Okay.
So they're expected to make a decision by March 2025.
So we could potentially see this new class of antibiotics hitting the market soon.
Yes, and I think that's going to be something that Pfizer's going to have to watch very closely.
Yeah, absolutely. It could really shake things up in the UTI treatment landscape.
For sure.
Now, another area where Pfizer is facing some competition is in the treatment of ATTR-CM. And this is coming from Alnilam, which has a drug called Amvuttra,
Yeah,
and it's been approved by the FDA.
got it.
Now, Pfizer also has a drug in this space.
They do,
It's called Vyndaqel.
right?
So now we've got these two drugs kind of going head to head.
It's getting competitive,
It is.
but they are different types of drugs.
Right. So can you break it down for us? How do these two drugs actually work?
Yeah, so Amvuttra, it's also known as vutrisiran.
Okay.
It works by using RNA interference.
Okay.
And basically what it does is it reduces the amount of a specific protein that's involved in this disease.
Okay.
And that protein is called TTR.
TTR.
Now, Vyndaqel, it takes a different approach.
Okay.
It works by stabilizing that same protein.
So one's trying to reduce it and one's trying to stabilize it.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
And so these differences in their mechanisms of action, they could make one drug more suitable for certain patients than the other.
Okay. So it's not just a matter of which drug is better. It's also about which drug is better for a particular patient.
Right. It's all about personalized medicine.
Absolutely.
And another factor to consider is the price.
Yeah. Pricing is always a huge issue, especially when you're talking about new drugs.
Definitely. And in this case, Amvuttra has a significantly higher list price than both Vyndaqel and another competitor called Attruby, which is made by BridgeBio.
Wow. So that could be a barrier for some patients.
It could, and it could also affect how insurance companies decide to cover it.
Yeah, they're going to have to make a strong case for why their drug is worth the extra cost.
Exactly.
So it's interesting to see how this competition is going to play out.
For sure.
Okay, now let's step back a little bit and look at the bigger picture of Pfizer's growth opportunities.
Okay.
And I'm particularly interested in how they're approaching global expansion.
Right.
Because they're already a global company, but there are always new markets to tap into. So what can you tell us about their overall financial health and their growth strategy?
Well, their 2024 results were pretty impressive.
Okay.
They had a 7% increase in operating income.
Okay.
And even if you exclude the contributions from Paxlovid and Comirnaty, which were their big COVID-19 products,
Yeah.
their operating income still grew by 12%.
Wow, that's a strong indicator that they're not solely reliant on their COVID products anymore.
Exactly.
So what were some of the key drivers behind that performance?
Well, the revenue from their Segan acquisition,
Okay.
that definitely contributed.
Yeah.
They brought in about $3.4 billion.
Wow.
And they're also seeing continued strong performance from some of their other established products,
Okay.
like the Vyndaqel family, Eliquis, Xtandi, and Nurtec.
So it seems like that Segan acquisition is already making a positive impact.
It seems like it is.
And what are their projections for the future?
So they're expecting revenues to be between $61 and $64 billion in 2025.
Oh.
And earnings per share to be between 2.8 as $0 and $3.
Okay.
And they're really anticipating that most of that growth is going to come from their non-COVID products.
So it's a good sign that they're diversifying their revenue streams.
It is.
But their future success is still going to hinge on a few key things, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the continued success of their oncology portfolio is going to be really important.
Yeah.
They also need to make sure they're launching new innovative products.
Right.
And they also need to keep a close eye on their operational efficiency and their costs.
So it's really a multi-pronged strategy.
It is.
Now, I know that Pfizer has a huge global presence already, but how are they looking at expanding their market reach, especially in areas like Europe and Asia?
Well, those markets are definitely key to their future growth plans.
Okay.
Europe is already a big part of their business,
Yeah.
and they've got a lot of operations there.
Oh,
They've got manufacturing facilities, they've got R&D sites,
okay.
and then Asia, particularly China, that's another area where they're really focusing on expanding.
Yeah, I mean, those Asian markets are growing so rapidly.
They are.
And there's just a huge population there with a growing need for healthcare.
Exactly.
So it makes sense that they would want to increase their presence there.
And they're putting their money where their mouth is. They've invested over $1.5 billion in China.
Wow, that's a significant investment.
It is.
And what about other Asian markets?
They're also looking at expanding into other Asian markets like Vietnam,
Okay.
through partnerships and local manufacturing.
So really trying to tailor their approach to each specific market.
Exactly.
And I'm also curious about their ongoing investment in research and development.
Yeah, that's always a big one for pharmaceutical companies.
It is, because that's where the new innovations come from.
Exactly. And Pfizer is planning to spend between 10.7 and 11.7 billion dollars on R&D in 2025.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is,
But it really underscores their commitment to staying ahead of the curve.
for sure.
And they're also really focusing on rare diseases.
They are. They want to be a leader in that space.
Interesting.
And so they're working with a lot of early stage companies that are doing innovative research, especially in areas like gene therapy.
So it sounds like they're taking a very long-term view of their research and development efforts.
Yeah, they're definitely playing the long game.
Okay, now let's talk about something that's always top of mind for investors, which is shareholder value and the company's overall financial health.
Of course.
And in the case of Pfizer, their dividend policy is something that a lot of people are interested in.
Right.
So can you give us a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, so Pfizer has a really solid track record when it comes to dividends.
Okay.
They've been paying and increasing their quarterly dividend for over 15 years.
Wow, that's a really long streak.
It is.
And so their annual dividend has been steadily climbing.
It has.
And they just recently announced that they're increasing their Q1 2025 dividend to 43 cents per share.
Yeah, that's their 345th consecutive quarterly dividend.
Wow, that's incredible.
And it represents 16 years of straight dividend growth.
So it's a pretty clear signal to investors that they're committed to returning value.
It is.
And their current dividend yield is around 6.5%.
Which is pretty attractive.
It is, especially in this current market environment.
For sure. But there is one thing that investors should be aware of.
Okay, what's that?
Their dividend payout ratio has been pretty high lately.
Okay.
It was actually over 100% in 2024,
Wow.
and it's projected to stay high in 2025.
Okay, so what does that mean for investors?
Well, it means that they're paying out more in dividends than they're earning.
Oh, okay.
And while management has said that they're committed to maintaining and growing the dividend,
Okay.
if their earnings don't start to catch up, it could become unsustainable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So investors need to keep an eye on that.
Right, it's a balancing act between that attractive yield and the long-term sustainability of those payments.
Exactly.
Okay, now I want to talk about some of the strategic acquisitions and partnerships that have been floating around.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of speculation about Pfizer potentially buying certain companies.
There has.
One of them is Viking Therapeutics.
Yeah, they've got that promising weight loss drug.
Right, VK2735 free.
Right.
And it's targeting some of the same mechanisms as some of these other successful weight loss medications.
Exactly.
They've also got that VK2809, which is a MAS therapy.
That's right.
So there's a lot of potential there for Pfizer to really get into the weight loss market.
There is. But they just spent $43 billion to buy Segan.
Yeah, that's a big acquisition.
It is. So they might not be ready for another one just yet.
Yeah, they might need some time to digest that one.
Right.
What about Merck? There's been some talk about that. As
Yeah. I mean, that would be a huge deal.
It would be a mega merger.
Right.
But I haven't seen any, really solid reasons for why that would happen.
I haven't either.
They have collaborated on drug development in the past,
They have.
but a merger of that size would face so many regulatory hurdles, and it would be incredibly complex to integrate.
It would be a logistical nightmare.
It would.
So I think that one is pretty unlikely.
Okay, now what about Bridge Bio? They're the ones with Attruby, which directly competes with Vyndaqel.
Right.
So would it make sense for Pfizer to just buy them out?
It could.
Okay.
I mean, it would eliminate a competitor,
Right.
and it would give them access to a potentially best-in-class drug.
Yeah. BridgeBio claims that Attruby offers near-complete TTR stabilization,
They do.
which could be a significant advantage.
Yeah, for sure.
And I know BridgeBio's been trying to raise money to fund the commercialization of Attruby,
They have.
so this could be a good opportunity for Pfizer to swoop in.
It could.
And then finally, what about Haleon? Any chance they might try to buy back into Haleon after just selling their entire stake?
I highly doubt it. I mean, their whole strategy is built around focusing on biopharmaceuticals, and selling Haleon was a big part of that.
Yeah.
So buying back in wouldn't make any sense.
Seems pretty clear-cut. Okay, now let's wrap things up by talking about Pfizer's commitment to therapeutic advancement in some key areas.
Okay.
And we've already talked about their focus on oncology and rare diseases,
Right.
but I know they're also involved in other areas.
They are.
So, for example, what's their current involvement in Alzheimer's research?
So they actually ended their own internal Alzheimer's research a few years ago,
Okay.
but they're still involved in the field through collaborations.
Oh,
They're working with organizations like the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation.
so they're still contributing to the effort, even if they're not doing the research themselves.
Exactly.
And what about Parkinson's disease?
So they also stopped their internal Parkinson's research in 2018,
Okay.
but they created a company called Cerevel Therapeutics,
Okay.
and they basically spun off their Parkinson's assets into that company. And they still have a 25% ownership stake in Cerevel. And they also act as a contract manufacturer for other companies that are developing Parkinson's treatments.
So kind of a different approach to staying involved in that space.
Right. They're leveraging their expertise and their resources in a different way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about cystic fibrosis?
So they've got some ongoing research collaborations in that area.
All right.
They're working with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Therapeutics, or CFFT,
Okay.
and also the University of Iowa.
And these collaborations have been going on for a while, haven't they?
Yeah, they started back in 2010,
Okay.
and they're focused on developing new therapies,
Okay.
including things like CFTR modulators and gene therapies.
So they're really trying to push the boundaries of treatment for cystic fibrosis.
They are.
And then we've already talked about their focus on obesity with danuglipron.
We have.
So what about prostate cancer? What's their current activity in that area?
So they've got a lot of active research programs in prostate cancer, and they're running clinical trials to evaluate new treatment options,
Okay.
especially for the more advanced stages of the disease.
Okay.
And they're looking at things like combining an EZH2 inhibitor called mevrometostat with standard hormonal therapy.
Interesting. So it sounds like they're committed to advancing treatments across a pretty broad range of diseases.
Absolutely.
Okay, finally, let's touch on some of Pfizer's key collaborations.
Okay.
And one that comes to mind is their relationship with Amgen.
Right.
Now, there was some talk a while back about Pfizer possibly acquiring Amgen.
Yeah, that was a big rumor.
It was, but it never actually happened.
It didn't.
And at this point, it's probably less likely given Amgen's current market cap.
It would be a huge acquisition.
It would be massive. But they do have a history together.
They do.
Amgen actually bought a Pfizer manufacturing plant in Ireland back in 2011.
That's right.
And they're both members of this organization called Accumulus Synergy,
Okay.
which is basically a data-sharing consortium. So it's possible that we could see some more collaborations between them in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense for them to team up on certain projects.
Right. And then what about their relationship with GSK?
So now that the Haleon divestiture is complete,
Yeah.
their direct partnership in consumer healthcare has ended,
Right.
but they're both still major players in the overall pharmaceutical market.
Absolutely.
So I think it's very likely that they'll still interact in other ways.
Okay.
Maybe through licensing agreements or industry groups.
Okay.
And we also have to remember that GSK is developing gepotidacin,
Right.
which is going to compete with some of Pfizer's products.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag.
It is.
But overall, the Haleon divestiture really represents a strategic separation.
It does.
They're both going their own ways.
Exactly. They're both focusing on what they do best.
All right, so let's wrap up this deep dive into Pfizer.
Sounds good.
I think it's pretty clear that they made a big strategic shift by selling off Haleon and really focusing on innovative biopharmaceuticals,
Right.
particularly in areas like oncology and rare diseases.
For sure.
They've got some promising drugs in their pipeline.
They do.
Danuglipron in the obesity market is definitely one to watch.
Agreed.
And sulpinum's a big deal in the fight against antibiotic resistance.
Absolutely.
But they're also facing some competition.
They are. GSK and Alnylam are both coming at them with some new treatments.
Right. But their growth strategy is really focused on expanding their global reach.
It is. Europe and Asia are key markets for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're investing heavily in R&D.
Which is a good sign.
It is. Financially, they seem to be in a good position.
Yeah, they've got a long history of dividend growth,
They do.
but investors should definitely keep an eye on that payout ratio.
And to all of you listening out there, if you want to stay informed about future developments in this story and other compelling stories in the world of finance and innovation, please be sure to subscribe, give us a like, and activate those notifications. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.